Well, a good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Efficient Study Startup Best Practices from a Clinical Site Network. My name is Soumya Shashikumar, and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. I would also like to welcome our attendees viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, and I encourage you to submit questions as well as comments via the comments tab. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I would like to thank MVenio Research who developed the content for this presentation. MVenio Research, a PCM trials company, provides a scalable network of clinical trial sites strategically located in underrepresented communities to engage a diverse patient demographic. Their extensive global network comprises highly skilled clinicians, leading principal investigators, and cutting-edge research sites, allowing them to deliver high-quality clinical research services that prioritize reducing the burden on patient participation. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Jack Evans has over a decade of clinical research experience that spans over 5 continents and is knowledgeable in a vast array of therapeutic areas and trial designs across all phases of clinical development. As Vice President of Site Operations at MVenio, he is focused on developing infrastructure, high-performing teams, and leading operational delivery to grow business in a repeatable manner. A cross-functional and operational delivery leader, he was part of the team that built Europe's largest site network. And with over a decade of experience in project management and a proven track record of leading global teams, Tara Kidwell is a dynamic and results-driven professional. As the Senior Director of Global Project Management at MVenio, Tara excels in orchestrating complex projects, driving strategic initiatives, and fostering cross-functional collaboration. Her expertise spans clinical research, operational excellence, and innovative problem solving. Now, before we begin, we have a poll question for our audience members to interact with in real time. If you are attending via GoToWebinar, the poll is appearing on your screen now, and you can vote by clicking on any of the answers. For those of you watching via LinkedIn Live events, please feel free to share your thoughts and answers in the comments section. The question we have for you is, what is the average length of the study startup time for your clinical trials? Your answer options are less than 1 month, 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, and more than 9 months. Again, that question is, what is the average length of the study startup time for your clinical trials? The answer options again are less than 1 month, 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, and more than 9 months. I'll give our audience members a few more seconds to vote. Thank you again, audience members, for voting. We appreciate your participation. And it looks like most of you have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And it looks like 10% of you voted for less than 1 month, 19% voted for 1 to 3 months, 29% voted for 3 to 6 months, 24% voted for 6 to 9 months, and 19% voted for more than 9 months. Thank you so much, audience members, for voting. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Jack Evans. You may begin when ready.
Awesome. Have we got the slides? Here we go. Thank you. So I want to start off today by saying that nearly 8 months is the average timeline to get a study started. That seems like quite a lot when you bake it in. And this is data that has been taken from global sites across many continents, not just the US. I know a lot of our attendees today will be from the US. But when you factor that down to even some of the fastest starting Western countries, 5 to 6 months, is fairly common in those cases as well. It is worth noting that CROs are a lot quicker when doing this compared to sponsors per the data, but around 6 to 11 weeks on average quicker when a CRO is doing this. And really, why is that important? If we go to the next slide, please. So a lot of people will see this and think, well, what does that have in common? More than 4/5 of sites are failing to enroll on time. I think the key thing to sort of note here, if we go to the next slide as well, is clinical trials are linear in the way that they start up. So any delay that we see within site identification or study startup is going to have a knock-on effect. Not only is that going to have a knock-on effect and reduce enrollment periods for those sites, but it will compound across those sites that are part of the group as well. So for an example, if we're seeing across a network or even a study of individual sites across the board, 4 sites all having a week delay each, we're losing a month's enrollment period throughout that trial. That then has a knock-on effect, meaning that more than 80% of the trials across, I think there was nearly 600 in the case study that was taken for this, failed to enroll on time, and it's a metric that's often banded around our industry. What we have to remember there is any delays in enrollment are delays in capturing data, delays in follow-up visits, delays in clinical study report being submitted, and ultimately delays in marketing authorization. Marketing authorization delays, because of delayed enrollment in clinical trials, can cost as high as $8 million a day for some of the larger compounds that have been delayed. So some of the GLP-1s, for an etc., that we'd be seeing lately. Even when you boil it down to some of the lower level delays, 500,000 a day US dollars is fairly common for something that we would see. If we go to the next slide, please. I think why that's critical, not just for pharmaceutical companies, for biotech companies, but also for site networks, bringing it back to the topic for today, is that we're often talking around multiple sites enrolling on the same study. So if we have 5 sites on a particular trial and each of them is losing a day in getting started up, a day seems like nothing. A day can be a day of PTO, it could be a public holiday, it could be someone forgot to save a file down, they've got to ask for another email for it to get through in a reg pack. But ultimately, a day lost across 5 sites is a week enrollment lost across a site network. And all of these delays, a day of not enrolling patients in a vaccine trial could be 15, 20, 30 patients per site that are missed. Compounding over a period really has a hard hit on a network that's struggling with payment terms anyway. So becoming very slick in study startup, but also execution, is where we have to really become sort of on our game with it as a site network. The way that we do that at Invenio is through centralized services and governance structure across every aspect of our trial, right the way from site identification all the way through to delivery. And that is from everybody, myself included, right the way down to every study coordinator at a site being involved with the expectations that are expected of them throughout the study, what we submitted during feasibility, and what the enrollment and deployment strategy of this trial is. Tara, my colleague on the call, will go over some of the project management aspects of this now, but making sure that we are ready to go as quickly as possible and acting as one team, not individual departments, is really where we have to focus to make sure that 1 day's delay doesn't turn into a week's delay, which is not compounded into 10 weeks with 10 sites on board. So Tara, I'll pass over to you.
Great, thanks, Jack. All right, so here at Invenio, we typically are site ready within 4 to 6 weeks. So that's a pretty fast turnaround time. We do this by taking a very systematic approach to delivering our studies. So the standardized process is really what drives the project consistency and performance. We understand studies can be nuanced, but having that framework and systematic approach for each study to have a baseline to establish a firm foundation for study success is the approach that we take for every study. We do this by appointing a global project manager that serves as the primary point of contact for the sponsor and our customers throughout the duration of the entire study. So from startup activities all the way through closeout activities, the project manager is that central point of contact, not only externally, but internally for our internal stakeholders as well. So just to kind of, on the next slide, we'll go over why we feel project management is so critical and a little bit of how we implement a rapid and controlled startup process. So here we have the planning phase. So the project manager's key responsibility is to bring the organization's functional areas together to align on our critical pathway deliverables, timelines, and milestones. Setting those clear expectation between teams, and there are quite a few teams at play here, as Jack mentioned earlier, regulatory, site operations, clinical technology, our patient recruitment team. They are all critical to study success. So what we want to make sure from the onset of a project and a study that we ensure there's alignment around those critical pathway delivery deliverables, timelines, and milestones. So throughout, to streamline these processes, we've implemented standardized process to establish this firm foundation. We do this through routine planning cycles and check-ins to monitor startup activities and those deliverables that come along with it. The planning actually starts ahead of the actual startup, before the startup with the customer. Typically, as soon as a PSV is completed and we are site selected, there is preliminary planning that begins as early as that PSV, right after that PSV stage. So before a pre-study visit. While we may not have all the information readily available to us at that time, we do have enough information to at least start the planning process, and that all of our teams are trained on that process early on so that we can maintain consistencies. So the project manager has oversight of all of these moving pieces. All of the activities that are running, we know that they can run in parallel, that they're running sometimes out of order, even though it's a linear process. Sometimes we have things ahead of time or behind schedule than what we would expect. But what's most critical is that all those items are completed by the time of your site initiation visit. So that PM really has the holistic view and the best understanding on how siloed departments are making decisions and changes that can impact other areas. So it's critical that the PM communicates, manages change within the internal departments, and identifies risks that are happening during startup. We do all of this because our goal is to expedite the startup process. We want our sites to have more time to enroll participants. When you have multiple sites conducting the same study, as Jack mentioned, it could be if we get one site started up earlier, but if you have 4 sites and you have 4 sites starting up a week earlier, now you have a full month of enrollment because of your expedited startup time. And of course, the last item here is accountability. The PM continues to support the study all through startup, but also as we move into study conduct. There is no handoff. We don't have a startup team that moves into an execution team. It's the same point of contact. That PM remains at the forefront to drive accountability and maintain project targets. So that's a little bit regarding the why we operate this way. But if we can go to the next slide, we can review more of the infrastructure that supports that. So We do have a centralized infrastructure. Our sites are dispersed across the country, but our centralized departments and infrastructure support that site network and teams. So as you can see here from the diagram, our patient recruitment and community engagement teams are centralized. They develop strategies centrally, but they also take into consideration when developing those strategies local challenges that they can predict from the beginning. But those strategies can be deployed across multiple sites and not just one site. So we are able to leverage that benefit with that central structure. Our goal is ultimately to reduce the burden of our site staff so that they can focus on that patient experience and the visit conduct. Our PI oversight, while our PIs are remote in our operating model, they have routine check-ins with our team to provide the site staff the support that they need. Of course, not only the PIs are supporting the site staff, but our site operations team, we do have site directors and CRCs that are also supporting centrally, doing quality checks and also providing direct support to the site. Also, accumulating lessons learned across all of our sites to be able to deploy them, learnings from one site to another site. Again, the project management is like the glue to all of those moving pieces across all the functional areas. On the right-hand side here, you can see non-study specific departments that are also centralized that play a large role in our ability to maintain like standardization across our sites. So we have our centralized quality and training team that helps build redundancy in our site training. Contracting and finance, and whether you're a new partner or existing partner, we have found ways to expedite those processes as well. And on our next slide, I'll go into our site operations management system on how it supports our startup process, but we also have our human resources team and staffing that also supports our coverage there. All right, so our site operation management system, our SOMS, centralizes all of our study operations into one system. So we have our EISF, our eConsent, our eSource, our diary management. It's all done in one platform. The clinical technology build for the study also starts very early in the planning process. It requires site team training, user acceptance testing, but our goal is to have our team trained and tested on our platform before site activation, so that when we do get site activation and we get the green light for enrollment, we aren't tripping over ourselves and finding issues coming up because we've already prepared ahead of time, running through mock visits and making sure that we've tackled any roadblocks that that could pop up along the way. So again, we do this all prior to our site initiation visit. So on day one, we can begin enrollment. So again, accelerating and extending our enrollment period. Our SOMS also allows easy study management, visibility to enrollment timelines, enrollment metrics. It really provides a platform for each site to operate under the same parameters and guidelines. So more of the standardization across the board. We can quickly apply lessons learned from one site to another, but our systems also track at both a macro and micro levels. Here in monitoring, another benefit of our system is that we can reduce the amount of time monitors need to be on site. So since we have this electronic platform, we can provide access to monitors so that they can review data and source not at our site. So again, it really can avoid disrupting our enrollment or our study conduct by having that accessible for monitors. And it can just really reduce the time that monitors need to be actually on site. And lastly, of course, reporting. The reporting mechanism can really allows us to aggregate our study data, to view trends, to understand what's working, what isn't working, and also be able to share that progress with the sponsors and customers. All right, I will pass it back over to Jack to talk about quality assurance.
Thanks, Tara. So I think something to sort of hit upon here is we've heard sort of how integral a solid project management function is to getting started up quickly and pulling those teams together. But standardizing across the board for a quick startup isn't as easy as one of Tara's team beating everybody over the head with a big stick and hoping everyone goes in the same direction. We have to really have a solid framework of policies, procedures, and training on those to make sure that we are adhering to this without one single person having to control everything going on in the organization. This in Envenio has been built up through a number of years of experience, both in and outside of our organization from individuals, building how we would get started up in a quick and easy way with checks and balances along the way that the project manager can then sign off on. What we're not looking for is for somebody to hold the hand of the clinical teams right the way through, but to enable them to do things best by reviewing through stage gate reporting throughout that startup cycle and milestone tracking. So our SOPs, our quality management system, our suite of policies and work instructions are all optimized and reviewed after the startup of every project that's going on. We're not changing them after every project, of course, but there are items and aspects to these policies that work well in some instances, large-scale vaccine trials, and others with multiple vendors, maybe not so much. Making sure that we are compliant across our policies and procedures is absolutely critical. Any startup that we can do as quickly as we would like to is really impeded a lot of the time if clients, sponsors, CROs, biotech companies are wanting to, for an example, PSV one site versus PSVing all of our sites, or doing a remote PSV versus an on-site PSV. We have to maintain trust in our clients. We have to show that we are capable and compliant with our systems in order for that to be allowed. So really, it sounds ridiculous talking about compliance during the startup period, but if we don't have the right standard in our regulatory submissions, if we don't have the right standard in what we're telling customers at the beginning to work versus what they're seeing as an SIV or as a PSV, things will get delayed. So making sure that we're on the straight and narrow with that is absolutely key. One function that we do have that are bundled under the quality assurance bracket here, but is actually a separate function within Envenio, is we have a separate standards and training team that reports into our medical affairs group, making sure that people are trained both in research, if they're fairly new to the discipline, or clinically trained in the aspect that they're working on is absolutely critical. We've probably all seen in the past number of studies that have come through with procedures that nurses, nurse practitioners, PAs will have done for years and years within practice, gone into research and have not done it for a handful of years afterwards. And keeping your hand in on some of these skills is absolutely critical. We've all seen, COPD studies, asthma studies come through where the last time that somebody did a spirometry was back at college, whereas now they're going to be doing it day by day and being signed off by a central vendor to make sure that they're competent in doing so. Us building in that training process in the study startup phase allows us to pass those assessments and move on to the SIV and activation much, much quicker. And of course, all of this gets pulled together with data, metrics, and KPIs that we're looking at in terms of things like protocol deviations, training pass rates, days from PSV to contract to SIV, trainings completed by the study team. We all know that there's hundreds and hundreds of trainings these days that are required. Making sure that they're done well in advance, making time and carving that out of the clinics is key to being able to get started on time and extend our enrollment period. We go to the next slide, please. One thing that people often think is a bit ridiculous talking about during a study startup presentation is how we manage inventory at our sites. So later on in this presentation, you will see that some of our units our community research sites, as sort of indicated by one of the mobile RV icons on the bottom here. So space for us is at a premium, but this is not just for sites that have got limited space. How many times have we all had lab kits delivered, and we've had month 36 lab kits delivered to a site that expire in 2 years? And they all go in the bin. It's a waste of space, a waste of time counting them. And we are focused more on the volume of things that are being delivered versus the volume of usable kits that are being delivered. Recently, we even had experience where we've had a large-scale vaccine study start up and 5 lab kits for screening be delivered at one point. Well, when we're looking at doing, between 5 and 12 of those participants a day, it's not going to take us very long to get through it. So not only the communication of how we manage that, but how we keep track of it internally. That goes for the same thing across drug, across devices, equipment, any study materials and things that we may have. So a centralized vision of what is happening at a site level from our project management and from our site management team is absolutely key. I will say we use a system at Invenio called Slope Clinical. We do have a case study that can be downloaded after this presentation of the collaboration that we've got between ourselves and Slope. There's no commercial arrangement there. It's purely the fact it's a great system, but I do want to shout out that that is a free tool for people to use if they want to get a handle on what's being used, how it's being used, the expiry dates, the tracking, and making sure that you start up in sort of a hiccup-free fashion. If we go to the next slide, please. So I guess this wouldn't be a proper presentation without a case study of how we do this. And I always like to caveat these sorts of things with putting our money where our mouth is a little while. This is a case study that we've had back end of last year, actually, for a vaccine trial, where it was a client that we'd never worked with before at Invenio. And that's really important to note, because that means that we have no confidentiality disclosure in place. We have no contract templates. We've never done a CTA with them. We don't have an MSA with them. So we were starting completely from scratch, just like any other site would do with a brand new sponsor. That's meant we've had to go through a full education piece of what we do, how we do it, how we find our patients, build a proposal to them, get signed off in PSVs, negotiate budgets, contracts, IRB submissions, and so forth. And we managed to go from the initial conversation that we had with a customer, no NDA in place, to first patient in just over 5 weeks' time. The takeaway from this is that when we start to develop those relationships with customers as a network of multiple sites across the US and entering into Europe, is that we do standardize those documents. The CDA is already completed. There's a master service agreement in place. There might be a rate card in place, which can shave even further days off there. So just want to tie this back of a 5 week and 1 day period from initial conversation can be brought down by another 7 to 10 days without fail, even beating some of those timelines that Tara was mentioning earlier on today. If we go to the next slide, please. I think this is you, Tara.
Yes. This kind of goes into our wider network now. Just a quick overview, of course, we can't do any of this without our experienced clinical staff and our teams. Here we're highlighting our PI clinical experience and expertise. Having a vast amount of experience within the team and across multiple therapeutic areas, it really allows best practices and those that may or may not be more experienced to share those across all of our sites. So not only do our PIs have a high volume of experience here, but our site staff and CRCs just also bring a wealth of knowledge to ensure study success and protocol compliance. Jack's going to give you, as he mentioned earlier, a quick glance into some of our sites. So I will pass it over to you, Jack, for that.
Thank you. So as a quick view into those, for those people that don't know Invenio or haven't seen any of our sites, we do run a mixture of what we call community research sites across our business. These are a mixture of mobile units, which don't really move. I'll come on to that in a moment, which you'll see on the top left, and hospital-based locations, which you'll see on the right-hand side. So some of the photos of our lab, pharmacy, and some of the clinic rooms that we have across. We do this for a number of reasons. So what we like to do at Invenio is provide access to clinical trials to communities that otherwise wouldn't have access. And barriers to access in trials can mean a number of things. It might be a lack of trial sites within the area. It might just be that somebody's scared to walk into a big academic institution and meet a professor in a white coat. There's various stigmas and barriers to people, entering into a clinical trial. The way that we break those down is by, like I said, either one, putting these mobile units that we have in static locations within communities that don't have access, or by placing dedicated clinical research sites inside of the prime healthcare network within the US, which I think at the moment is about the 5th or 6th largest by revenue in the United States this year. Those are hospitals that do not have access to clinical trials. So by putting dedicated sites in there, it's not breaking the mold from our model, but it's really giving access to the community of patients within those locations. We further bolster that by making sure that all of the staffing is recruited in from that local community. When there are barriers to entry in clinical trials, you want to go into a trial site and see people that both look, feel, and speak like you do from that community. You don't need any further alienation there. And then taking advantage of downtime, volunteering in those communities. We've got case studies of volunteering with women's health refuges, food banks, food drives, community festivals. Just, I think 2 days ago, we were at the Reflections Festival up in Atlanta, Georgia. So really trying to give back to the community and making sure that the people that are being met at these large scale events, at the places where they have to go to survive, when they're coming into our site, seeing a friendly and familiar face. And that's kind of the ethos of what we're doing across Invenio, across the locations in the States. If we go down to the next slide, please, I'll just go over a brief overview of where we're currently based. So we have 17 active community research sites based within the United States at the moment, which we'll discuss today. 4 of those are in prime hospitals, which are located by some of the light blue dots here in Atlanta, Georgia, Garden City, just outside of Detroit, Michigan, Dallas, Texas, and also Kansas City. The remainder of our sites that we have are based within communities within our mobile units. Those mobile units, like I mentioned earlier on, are static. So they do have a static address. They are hooked up to power and do not move. They have to operate in one place as per the IRB approvals, per the address on the 1572 in the consent form. So they do operate just like a normal research site, but based in a community where the patients need us. We have 2 sites in both Oklahoma City and in Phoenix, Arizona. And those are, the reason we have 2 there is we have sponsored dedicated units that sponsors have commissioned from us purely for the exclusive use for their clinical trials that they'll be enrolling there. I'll pass back to Tara now for a brief summary of how we accelerate.
All right, great, yep. So really just to summarize our discussion, the key to accelerated study startup lies within removing a lot of burden from those sites and really centralizing and standardizing our processes. The global project management team ensures that there is that single source of truth, a single point of contact, and really a resource for escalation to manage project expectations and risk. So I know like if you have one site, there may not be that need for a project manager, but across multiple sites running the same study, there's really just that benefit of being able to start up at an expedited speed by applying the same thing across those multiple sites. So even though the standardization, and we have that standardization and that framework, the repetition of delivering a study the same way for every study, it just really also helps us, our team, to focus on what their expectations are, so they're clear and they're aligned from the onset for every study. And then like our technology is just a vehicle to monitor compliance and performance across multiple sites. So those combined efforts really leads to those accelerated study startup. I think that pretty much wraps up kind of what we wanted to share today. So just wanted to thank everybody for joining today, but I think there is some time for some questions.
Well, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments for the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are attending via GoToWebinar, please use the questions window. For those of you watching on LinkedIn Live events, feel free to post your questions in the comment section. I have already received some questions, so I'll start with those. Now, our very first question here, Batara, I think this one might be for you. This audience member is wondering, within mVenue, is it a CRA that acts as a project manager, or is the project manager a separate position?
That's a good question. No, the project management is a separate position at mVenue, and really, again, that is due to the site network and to have oversight and making sure that each site is operating consistently for the same study.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Our next question here is wondering, how does the Site Operation Management System, or SOMS, integrate with other systems used by sponsors and CROs?
That's a good question. I'll take that one. So the Site Operational Management System is something that does not integrate with other systems from the sponsor. It's purely for in-house usage. So what you will often find with trial sites is that the data that's being collected, the documents that are being collected, are a vessel for other data sources. So we will be using it as e-source internally, which will then be transcribed into any EDC that the sponsor decides to use. And we will be using it as an electronic investigator site file within the business. So ultimately, whilst that is part of the wider trial, of course, the documents that are taken from there by our clients are then put into the trial master file at the end. So there isn't any integration between that. And the reason is purely because the data ownership has to sit with the site. In the longer term, will there be automated data flow between eSource and ECRF? Possibly. I think our coordinators would probably like that. It would reduce the burden quite heavily, but I don't think we're quite yet there yet as an industry.
All right, thank you so much for that. Our next question here is wondering, have your monitors been unable to review all data from a site due to the SC not uploading all the appropriate data and thus increasing queries? For example, study drug dosing.
No, that's a great question as well. So the e-source that we use within mVenue is direct entry. So a lot of the upload is a non-issue, it's a non-requirement. There are some forms that are required, but things like, let's say you're sitting with a patient and you're taking a blood pressure, you write the blood pressure directly into e-source. It's 21 part 11 CFR compliant. So ultimately, whatever time you are entering it is the timestamp that is taken for that blood pressure. So it removes the need for writing it down, scanning it in, certifying as a copy and uploading it. There are some items like lab requisition forms or unblinded dose forms that are required, but because these are often so minimal, the delay there is negligible. So it's I can quite happily say we've never had a delay from a monitor where data has not been ready for review from the source perspective.
That's good. Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question here is, for the units being placed in the hospitals, how long did it take for those to actually start up, and who funded them? And are the sites only doing mVenue studies? Jack, would you be able to shed some light on this one?
Sure. So the startup is, it's a tricky one to answer because a lot of the initial startup of a site, we're not talking about a study startup here, but a site startup. So a site startup, of course, requires a lot of business permits, licenses to go along with it, along with tenant improvements, renovations, equipment purchasing, sign off and things like that. So the project that we have for our 4 sites at the moment that are active in the US has been ongoing for about a year, and 4 of them are active. We've been active in them, ready for PSVs since around about the middle of July period at this point. So I would say that from the very beginning, it took us probably about 8 months. They are only doing studies within Venio. We are a private commercial research entity that is based within a hospital. It's not an integrated research site. It is a dedicated site based just on hospital premises. We do have access to their EMR for patient recruitment, which will really help. And also we do have access to their pathology, diagnostics, and other specialities within there to utilize. But it is a standalone research site.
Thank you so much for that. Now, this audience member is wondering, if we involve several MVenue facilities in a study in the US, is there only one budget and contract to be executed? Jack, would this be something in your area of expertise?
I'll let Tara handle that one.
Yes, so you can have one clinical trials agreement, but then there are also, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but like there's one master services agreement with a sponsor, but then we can also have site-specific statements of work that go along with all of our sites. We've actually operated in 2 different ways where we've done them combined, but also separate as well. I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on that, Jack.
No, I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, we prefer one contract because it makes the project manager's life a little bit easier to have one contract, one statement of work to review. But some sponsors and CROs processes just don't allow for that. So the way that we would typically negotiate them is we would negotiate one CTA and budget, and then we would copy paste it for all the other sites. So effectively, the streamlining there is still by getting one document reviewed and negotiated. You're not involving 4 separate negotiators or 5 separate negotiators for a 4 or 5 site study. You're just doing one, then cut, paste, and move along. It does help speed up things, but also helps the management moving forward.
All right, thank you so much for that. The next book question that we have for you is, what are the best practices for book communication between sponsors, CROs, and sites?
Yes, I can take that one. Some of the best practices that we've learned, especially in our unique model that Jack described today with our mobile sites, but also we have our brick and mortar locations, is just oftentimes we have a kickoff meeting that really aligns the 2 teams on reviewing the scope of work again, but also re-educating on our model here at Invenio. So it's important to know that we do have centralized functions, and I know a lot of normal site networks, there could be essential documents that get sent directly to PIs, but within our organization, all of that is centralized. So best practices is to ensure that there is alignment and understanding on how we operate in order to expedite. So if we're having to collect that data piecemeal to different sites within our organization, streamlining that approach and having that all driven through the project manager is just really something we emphasize at the very beginning of the study.
All right, thank you so much for that. Now, someone's wondering what lessons have been learned from past study startups that can help improve future processes.
There's been a lot. I think it's hard to nail it down. Every study, I mean, Tara, correct me if I'm wrong here, but every study we find something new. Every trial protocol that comes through the door for us is different. You'll have nuances with date ranges that you might have for external examinations. You'll have blinding, unblinding, limitations on how many patients you can screen before a monitoring visit, additional levels of sign-off. So I think the list is probably as long as my arm of what we go through, but a lot of it is also very business specific, what your PR model looks like, what your site model looks like, your staff availability, what client you're working with. Some clients, some sponsors, some biotechs, some CROs will have different provisions in their contract they will and will not accept, and as a business you have to overcome those risks and get to the point of balancing your delays in starting up versus the business risk that you have. So I'd love to be able to give some specific examples, but there are literally thousands of them.
Thank you so much for that. Now, someone here is wondering what new technologies are being explored to further improve study startup processes.
Could you repeat that? Sorry, please.
Sorry, the question was, what new technologies are being explored to further improve study startup processes?
So internally, we have our own platforms for study startup. We know that it's difficult with sponsors at times because they're using multiple vendors. Having that vendor list early on can help, and getting training to those vendors in certain portals can help, but internally we manage our task deliverables all within our own project management platform here.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for that. Now, the next question that this audience member is asking is, I'm sorry, does the immediate source data entry by the physician eliminate the role of the study coordinator, who usually is the character that transfers all the source data into the CRF?
That's a great question. So no, we're not entering the source data directly into the CRF. We have to maintain a level of ownership of source. So source documentation is under the ownership of the site and under the ownership of the principal investigator, not the ownership of the sponsor. The sponsor owns the data, of course, that's entered then into the eCRF, but not the eSource. So the source is still having to be transcribed from A to B in a lot of cases. And it makes no difference in sort of process and workload as to whether something's being done electronically or on paper. But what benefit it does have, which I think Tara covered in the site operational management section of the presentation, is we get to control centrally what is collected, what order things are collected in, and version control any releases that we may have. So it means that every site has the ability to immediately launch protocol amendments, changes to source, adaptations that we have to source, and not delay. So you further increase compliance by doing so, by making sure that people aren't missing vital aspects in protocol amendments or using an old printed piece of source that was sort of left lying on the desk at one side. So it doesn't sort of reduce the role of the coordinator in any way, but it does increase compliance drastically.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for that answer. This audience member is wondering, what is the main TA focus at Mvenio, or is it really a split between all of them?
That's a really good question. So the TA focus, I think, it's more so chronic ambulatory. We do a lot of infectious disease, a lot of vaccine work, as do a lot of site networks, but chronic ambulatory and sort of therapeutic areas or indications that the communities are suffering with around our locations that do not have access to the relevant treatments. That's kind of the first way of looking at it. The second way is really looking at the complexity of a protocol, and I can give an example for this. We're doing some work in MASH at the moment, and we actually have we had a feasibility that came in for a couple of our mobile community units, and whilst we were selected to be able to do so, there was such a large volume of external procedures that were required. I think there were 13 external procedures. Tara, correct me if I'm wrong on that, with biopsies, fibroscans, CT scans, upper gastroscopies, et cetera, right the way through. That meant that although it was possible, it wasn't the best site model for the job. So we're actually running those now in our dedicated sites within the hospitals, utilizing the hospital facilities. So therapeutic area for us is one thing, can we find the patients? But the second thing is, have we got the capability on site for the assessments? And even if we have, what is the burden on that patient looking like? We're looking to reduce patient burden, not increase it. So having something that can be done in one place versus messing a patient around consistently is something that we do look at within that really initial study strategy build in the feasibility stages.
Thank you so much for that, Jack. Now we have a two-part audience member question. It goes like this. Do sponsors generally approach you with a complete set of documents, that is protocols, IBs, manuals, etc. initially? How do you keep your timelines down if you need to rely on the sponsor for required documents?
Yeah, so it's twofold here. There at times we may be entering into a study and the study's already enrollment. So all of those essential documents are available to us. However, there are times when we're brought in on the very front end of a study starting up, and we are missing the lab manual and we are missing the pharmacy manual. And there are times that we are operating at risk and we move forward with studies with not having a complete set of documents. So it's oftentimes we do have at least the bare minimum of like the protocol, and we're able to at least start with what they do have. And the second part of that question is how are we able to maintain our timelines? That's exactly it. We can only maintain our timelines. And so while we are site ready and we have gone through all of our standardized procedures, if the IP is not ready to be shipped to our sites or any sites, the delay at that point becomes on the sponsor. So we can only control things that are within our control to maintain our timelines. If those gets pushed by the sponsor, those things are not avoidable on our end, such as lab kits and IP and any other type of delays that are sponsor driven.
I'd probably just add to that as well that in the initial startup phase, you have to treat feasibility as an expanded process and not a single point in time, because you learn things as things go. So you might get any commercial sites on the call, or even I guess some academic centers will have had comments or sort of requests from their partners that says, hey, can you enroll a phase 3 ulcerative colitis trial? And the answer is yes or no. It's binary at that point, and they might not be able to share any further information due to confidentiality. So there's a constant assessment of, are we able to do this trial? What new information has come to us, and are we still able to do this trial? And really, as that goes into the negotiation process and starts into study startup, that's where the project manager comes into their own. Because if you have 5, 6, 7, or even 10 sites on a given project, maybe even more, what you don't want is localized decision making around new information that may come in at different times. So having Tara's team within Invenio keeping a very close eye on the scope of, actually, that's not what we agreed to when we first started, or this has changed. How does that impact our budget? How does it impact the patient flow? Can we still do this? It's treated more of a process versus a static time point is probably the way I'd look at it.
Right, thank you so much for that. Now we have another question, and I think we can hear from both of you for this. The question is, what are the better ways to expedite IRB approvals and clinical trial agreements executions?
I'll take the IRB approval one to start with then. So IRB approval, we typically work with, or we only exclusively work with central IRBs. So you unfortunately are at the mercy for most of the time of the IRB that the sponsor's using for their main submission. But I think maintaining a good relationship with them is absolutely key. So our head of regulatory that we have here at Invenio, a lady called Stephanie, is in constant communication with our IRBs, the ones that we're using, be that about trial protocol approvals, be about site approvals, changes, it might be protocol deviations, it might be internal documents and advertisements that we're getting approved, but that constant communication and building a rapport with someone, committing to the timelines that we say for revisions and things like that is really key to making sure that you build trust on both sides. Some IRBs go through quick periods, some go through slow periods, depending on their workload there. But maintaining that relationship, I think, is absolutely key to making sure that we're top of that pile when it comes through. And I can say to date that we do not have any issues at all with IRB approvals within Envenio. I can't remember a time that we've had any turnaround time that's lasted more than about 8 or 9 days at this point. So we're in pretty good standing there.
Yeah, the only piece I would add to just the IRB is that there are times where sponsors operate differently, where they would like to review prior to our submission. So there are things that for IRB submissions, whether it's our patient recruitment material or our consent, that we provide the sponsor booked ahead of time, so they have a chance to feed back on that prior to submitting to the IRB. So that can also help reduce some of the timelines with IRB, that we're getting that on the front end feedback of those submissions.
Yeah, and then I think the CTA expedition is very similar to any of the issue resolutions that Tara and team are doing, which is having an organizational governance structure with your clients. So often what you'll find, and where the frustration with a lot of sites is that we're operating at a level where the site is discussing everything directly with their CRA, or with the sort of the lowest point of sort of contact on the contract negotiation stage. What that means is there are very strict guidelines of what can and cannot be accepted in those stances. But by escalating that up a level or a level above, not only when you need it, but for general project updates, is really where a lot of the negotiation and the work gets done. So for an example, our project managers, Tara's team, are often speaking, sometimes multiple times a week, with project leaders, with project directors that are overseeing entire programs of work within sponsors, within CROs, so that when we have an issue, or likewise if they have an issue from their end with us, we have that open channel of communication that's not always at the lowest common denominator. So there will always be a conflict in legal language of what sites want versus what sponsors want, because everyone's got their own interest at heart there. The question is how do you overcome it? And if you've got somebody that's only negotiating within a very strict framework, you've got to take it to that next level up and have those discussions, but be prepared that when those discussions are happening, it's a two-way street. So if you've got escalations their way, that does open the road to escalations the other way. So it does make sure that you're sort of on top of your game, so to speak.
Yeah, and just from the project management perspective, like my direct contact with our contracting team is that I am in constant communication, reminding of, we are pre-planning ahead of time. So some of these things and activities are running in parallel. So we are already planning, and we're setting dates for SIVs and for when site activation is to occur. So constant communication on how we're approaching those critical milestones and timelines within our organization also helps move the CTAs at a faster speed to ensure we maintain those study timelines.
All right, thank you so much for that. And looks like we have time for one more audience question. Have you experienced a shortage in clinical supplies, non-IP, and what remedies have you instituted to procure them in a timely manner, and has that impacted SSU timelines?
That's a good question. I think, and I'm trying to understand the sort of the direction of this. So what Envenio do is we very rarely run trials where we're an adjunct to a standard of care, where we're like oncology studies, for an example, where we're taking over the SOC for the patient. So the procurement of medications and things locally for standard of care items is very, very rare when that will happen. We do have some where there's high levels of supplementation required or additional prescriptions that are required as well. But I would say that that's probably in the range of 5% of the studies that we operate on. So in terms of the client providing delays, and we typically say during those in those periods, what's going to be more efficient? Do we procure it or do we have it off you? If they're taking, and if it's from them, it's taking a lot longer, we'll say, don't worry about it, we'll procure it ourselves. So there's just a very strict decision to be made on what is more efficient versus the burden that it takes throughout the study. The last thing I want my site operations group doing is focused on consistent refilling of medication and scripts locally, when it could be provided in an automated manner from the sponsor. But if that means that the project management team, Tara's group, are coming to my team or myself and saying, hey, Jack, if we don't get this sorted locally, we're going to see a 4, 5, 6 week delay across our sites. It's a fairly easy decision to make. You just have to balance the workload and the burden on whether you want it to delay things or to cause a little bit more work later down the line.
All right, well, thank you very much for those answers and for all of the answers we have received today. We have, however, reached the end of the Q&A portion of this webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Mvenio Research may follow up with you. Or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email address on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Additionally, I have shared a link to view the recording of today's event in the chat box, and you can also share with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. For those watching via LinkedIn Live events, we encourage you to visit xtalks.com to register for this event and gain access to features such as viewing the recording and more. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers for their time here today. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.